Welcome to the Leadmore podcast. I'm your host, John T. Meyer. The Leadmore podcast is the show where we learn from leaders of the past and present to inspire and create more leaders for the future. In episode 12 here, we sat down with my friend, David Whitesock. Now, David has an interesting life journey. He was the radio DJ in North Dakota. He was one of the original people working in a podcasting business. He studied and wrote his master's thesis about Thomas Jefferson, was a 2016 Bush Fellow, and now is the founder and CEO of Commonly Well. David is also recovering from addiction, and because of that, it has shaped and informed a lot of the twists and turns of his life and what has brought to his work that he does today. You're going to hear some pretty fascinating stories from David, some really key moments in life where people advocated and stood up and pushed him to where he is now. And you're just really going to enjoy this conversation. We also talked about if you are a leader, an employer, how you can spot someone who may be struggling or fighting with addiction and what you can do to help them out. We talk about this topic and some other great discussions. So let's take a listen with the interview with David Whitesock. All right, welcome to the Leadmore podcast. I'm here with my good friend, David Whitesock. How are you, sir?
I'm well, John. Thank you so much. This is great.
Thanks for being here. How are things in Potsdam, New York today?
We're getting ready for the school year to start. We've got two college campuses here in this small town.
Two? I didn't know that.
A small private school, a lot like Augustana, and then a smaller state school. And the smaller school, Clarkson University, started 2 weeks ago, and SUNY Potsdam starts next week. And so we got testing sites set up and a very loud house down the way because the kids are back and having fun. And
you're back near some college housing, off campus housing, I guess you could say.
Well, we have a big house that's a rental that's across a field that we live near. And they were up late last night, but it's
maybe not a lot of social distancing.
Well, we'll see how the testing goes.
Yeah. Well, of course, you're there because your wife is an instructor there. She's a professional cello player and instructor she's at the SUNY one, right?
Correct.
Okay, cool. And let's start there because I love your guys' story. One thing that I think is so interesting is how you guys have been willing to achieve and chase your professional goals and still, make this partnership work, but sometimes not even doing it in the same spot. So I guess we can retrace a few steps, but you were most recently in Denver and you were apart for how long? That was a couple of years, wasn't it?
About 2.5 years.
Jeez. Wow. And what did you learn about your relationship through that process?
Well, you're leaving out another little part. For about 1.5 years, we did a little bit of distance living when she was in Vermilion. We had a house in Vermilion, South Dakota, and that's a 120-mile drive. I was working in Sioux Falls. And because of the Bush Fellowship, I had an opportunity to work on a little bit of relocation. And so that we had gotten an apartment in Sioux Falls just because I started having some back issues and just to be able to get more out of my time, we had an apartment in Sioux Falls. Yeah. And so we kind of started to figure that out a little bit. But we met in our mid-30s. Mm-hmm. So she had her career, I had mine. It was really a matter of what are the things that are important to us professionally and personally. Mm-hmm. And then how do we bring those things together that are respectful to each other's desires and hopes and dreams and what makes us happy. And so we've figured that out. And we don't necessarily need to be under the roof 24/7, although COVID has changed.
Would you say was there like a pivotal conversation someday along that journey that you guys sat down and figured that list out? Was it a gradual process? Has it evolved? That's a fascinating idea. It makes a ton of sense for couples to do that.
Yeah, in fact, on our second date, we were set up, and on our second date, we decided, you know what? Why don't we come to that date with a list of the 5 or 10 things that we want out of life, and we'll do a comparison. And
second date, wow.
Yeah, and so we learned that we were mostly compatible. And that sort of set a
Interesting.
tone. Interestingly, that just kind of set a tone. It was like, okay, we'll continue to figure this out, but on the things that are really important, we're aligned.
That's a really good exercise. I'm a big fan of, if you're familiar with Professor Scott Galloway, who runs the podcast Pivot, and he's a teacher at MBA school at NYU. He wrote a book about happiness, and he talks about how ultimately probably the most important decision you'll make is who you pick to be your partner. And so like setting the tone of what this wasn't just a fling of a relationship, it was a very serious, and he brought you these lists together, and I'm guessing a lot of the lists synced up.
Yeah, we each had about 5 things that we wanted, 5 things that we didn't. We were probably 60, 70%. I think the list exists somewhere. I haven't seen them in a while. And to your point, through that process, it didn't take long then to make a decision, right? I ended up proposing something like 55, 56 days later.
Whoa, okay.
We had a longer engagement because
Sure.
she's from Quebec and we got family all over the place. We had to figure out what we were going to do. But the decision to actually say, yeah, you're the one I want to continue this journey along with came pretty quickly.
So I'm going to ask one more question since we're on the topic of the relationship, and then we'll get back and explain Vermilion and Denver and all these places. But I know your wife, Maria Lane, just became a U.S. citizen last week. Tell me how that goes. What is that like, that naturalization ceremony?
Well, it's a little different today because family members and friends and community members aren't allowed into the ceremony. But the process, really began for her a few years after we got married, and we're sort of, getting to that place where, she had to decide about her lawful permanent residency, and just sort of checking through the boxes of becoming a citizen. And once you're on a visa, if you're a college professor or you work in the tech sector or in science, those visas really support a lot of great, talented people to be in the United States. And I think that ultimately is what I have found, especially during this time with a lot of discohesion in the United States, is just seeing somebody who brings joy through music and teaching through music to our fabric of our society, and doing that at a level that's both novice for some, but super expert professional for others, and just to be a witness to that, and just knowing that that's just one drop in a massive bucket of stories of people who have wanted to come to a place, found opportunity and a way to find their purpose in whatever measurable, meaningful way that is for them, and then to get to the moment where we're driving 2 hours to Plattsburgh, New York, and
never heard of that town.
Yeah, and just going to a small town in northern New York on Lake Champlain, and having her go in, masked up to have a ceremony with about 12 other people from 11 different countries, and come out, just excited and happy. It was a 20-year process for her. It was really, really cool.
Wow. And I want to know then, so you grew up in North Dakota, you lived in South Dakota, you're an American. What did it teach you about America, that process?
This is a big, broad generalization, but I think just paying attention, I think we as Americans lose sight and we take for granted often the things that really are the engine of this idea. I'm a historian by education, by trade, if you will.
Yeah, we're not going to be able to get through this podcast without talking about Jefferson. So you can
exactly, and so Thomas Jefferson, of course, and the American ideal is an ideal, and it's how do you bring people from a lot of different places into one place to excel in a remarkable way. I think so, at times we lose, with over generations, we lose touch to that. And I think the one thing that really did teach me is, I'm old enough to really remember how deeply ingrained civics especially community civics were in life. Coming in from a military family, the American Legion was always close. You had other community entities that you got involved with.
Mm-hmm.
And then just civics in school seemed to be more ever present than it is today. You really get back to the sort of simple part of that when you're going through the naturalization process.
Interesting. I was hoping that would be your answer, right? In this time of discord and a global pandemic. And, sometimes looking at the flag can be polarizing now, and how people feel about that. And a lot of that is important change that needs to happen. But also, I'm sure from the outside, through her eyes, you do see a little bit more appreciation of this great, American experiment.
Well, yeah, and I'll just take that opportunity to throw in Thomas Jefferson. He firmly believed, despite all of his, own personal challenges, and he firmly believed that his words were, "The land belongs to the living, the earth belongs to the living." And yet, we tend to go back in time to say, through our political discourse, we want to be true to what the founders believed. But if you really look at the way we constructed the Constitution, it was a document meant to be sort of a living operating manual for how we would progress as a people, as a society, and as a democracy. It should change with us. We tend to want it to be this thing, this monolith. And no, the earth belongs to us. So who are we today? We've got to figure that out. And then I think we need to sort of figure out whether or not we can update our operating manual.
Yeah, that's good. I like that a lot. Well, congratulations to Maria Lane, and I'm happy that you guys get to be together under one roof. Maybe it feels like a lot right now because of COVID. Let's start. I want to go through your journey, and you're one of the great thinkers, a great friend. So I know there's so many ways we could take this episode, but I do want to start at your story. If you're willing to share about kind of your podcast days, like before there was podcasting. I don't even know if we used that word back then, but I know you have a pretty fascinating story that involves a check and involves New York Times article, I believe. And so tell us that story. I think I want to start there.
Yeah, I had, this is late 2004, and I had just lost my job. I had been working in radio in Grand Forks, North Dakota for about 7 or 8 years. Done a bunch of different things in radio, was kind of a lead voice in that town. And I lost that job because of a DUI. My addiction was really, really driving my life at that time. And one of the things that I had done while I was at the radio station is I had taught myself to code and build websites. And, the perennial survivalist, when there is something that could take your life away. And so, when I lost that job, and after I got over the hump of, my pity, I realized I knew all the advertisers in the community and I could build a business. I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew that I could go do that. And some acquaintances of mine, some friends, were working in the web design space, and one of them had been tooling around in this thing called podcasting. He had connected with some of the folks that were working on it. There was a former MTV VJ. His name is escaping me now, Adam something.
Yeah, I mean, there may have been dozens of podcasts at that time.
Well, it wasn't even that there were dozens of podcasts. So that there was maybe 10 or 15 people in the world.
Sure.
That were sort of working on this. And then by the time that we kind of caught up to it, there's probably a few hundred, right?
Okay.
Podcasts that were coming forward. And luckily for me, I had a background in producing audio.
Mm-hmm.
So we all looked at each other and said, well, he knows advertising. He knows SEO marketing, because the SEO game back in the day on Google is you could really manipulate that.
Oh, that was huge. Yeah.
And then I knew how to produce a broadcast. And so we found 5 shows of different topics, and it got the attention of the New York Times. It got the attention of what I now understand, but didn't know then, of venture capitalists. And we went to a conference in New York City, and the way I remember it is, I was in the middle of a blackout at the time, but the way I've been told was we had somebody who was going to invest in us. And I had been given a check, a very big check, and I had ripped it up and said something to the effect of, "We were just in the New York Times. We don't need your money." And that began a pretty nasty swirl personally, and changed. That was one moment amongst a series of moments that began a big change process.
Yeah, and so we're definitely going to talk about addiction in this podcast because it's a part of your story and it's what you're working on now. And I think when you share your story as a leader, which I believe you definitely are, it's personal and it's powerful because it's personal. And so I remember how just there's so many moments of that story with the check and someone telling you this that you don't even remember is so poignant. So talk about some of those moments then. So how did you get to South Dakota?
Well, so I'm in New York City, and I come back to Grand Forks. We flew back to Grand Forks, and I was told that a few days after landing, after that trip to New York, that I should show up to an office building somewhere. And I did at the appointed time, and I was told to sign a few pieces of paper. And there were 3 copies of them, and they just said, sign all 3, take the middle copy, and leave. My advice is never do that. No matter what the circumstances are, don't ever do that. But I did that, and I went home, and I got into a pretty dark place for a while, and eventually was woken up one morning by my father, who I was living in my parents' basement, literally. And my dad woke me up. I was passed out, and he said, you need to leave. So after 12 years, he kicked me out of the house for the very first time. And he said, you've got 10 days, get out. You're not going to kill yourself, or you're not going to die in front of your mom. And so I knew the internet. So I got up, I showered, I got back on the computer, and found a job at a radio station in Winter, South Dakota. That was a Wednesday. I got an interview and had the interview on Friday. I started the job the following Monday.
Wow.
So that's how I got to South Dakota.
In about a couple of days, yeah, in winter, which is for people listening. How do I describe winter? Maybe you should describe winter appropriately versus me trying to take a guess.
It is
pretty rural South Dakota.
Rural South Dakota. It's right in the middle, South Central. It is, if you're driving along, there are grain towers. There are a couple of large buildings, like a courthouse, and a handful of bars. And it is known as the pheasant hunting capital of the world.
Mm-hmm. There you go. So you're in winter. You're doing radio, which came naturally to you. You were sort of a pro at that. But a big theme of this podcast has been leaders who have had other people nudge or push them toward new paths and new opportunities. And I know that you had one of those that took you then down the path of going to law school. And that's a good story too.
Yeah, and I'll try to make this relatively quick because there's a lot in there. So when I got to Winter and I was working at a radio station, I got on the air at 5 a.m. and I was off by 2:30. And that left me a lot of time. And so within 3 months, I picked up another DUI. It was my 5th DUI. But in the state of South Dakota, it was going to be a felony conviction. And through that process of getting convicted with a felony and having to hit restart, I went to treatment in Yankton while in jail. And it was at that moment that I was introduced to a sober home in Sioux Falls. So the judge wanted to know, she's like, I want, you're going to stay in my jail for 180 days. But if you come back to me with a plan for the next 365, I'll let you out early. So she really understood carrots and sticks. Yep. She hung 2 years of prison over my head. But she's like, give me a plan and I'll let you out early. And so my plan was a sober home in Sioux Falls. And she hadn't heard of that before. This is 2006. And so I moved to Sioux Falls. I'm kind of tooling around. I'm on my bike, riding everywhere. I lose 70 pounds by riding my bike every day. I got hit by a drunk driver, going to do my breathalyzer. I mean, you can't make some of this stuff up, quite frankly. And along the way, I realized I couldn't really get back into the swing of life just because of the hurdles that were in the way. And so the only thing I had going for me was a little bit of experience with college. I'd tried 3 times and failed, but I thought, maybe now is the time. I could go back to school. And so I wrote a letter to the judge. I had called the University of North Dakota, where I'd done most of my school, and they said they'd let me in with my 1.9 GPA. But I wrote a letter to the judge, and the judge wrote me back instantly, and she said, no, I will not let you go to the University of North Dakota. If you'd like to go back to school, I fully support it, but you're going to pick one of the fine institutions in the state of South Dakota. Now, this story works for those of you listening in the Dakotas. I grew up watching the University of North Dakota hockey program. I started college out of high school at North Dakota State because I wanted to become an architect. And for all of that time watching North Dakota sports, the Jackrabbits and the Coyotes were 2 schools I just didn't have any interest in. But I'd met somebody who said, if you want to go back into radio and you're kind of resetting your life, the place to go is the University of South Dakota. Mm-hmm. And I was like, there's no way. I'm not going to do that. But that's where I ended up going. Went to the University of South Dakota. And to your question about, people who figure us out and can nudge us towards something different and better. I needed an elective, and the elective was constitutional law. It was taught by a public defender. She was a public defender in Sioux Falls, and she convinced me, after having me do a mock Supreme Court argument. She convinced me to join her mock trial team. And she was 32 or 33. I'm 32 or 33. And so hanging out with 19-year-olds at Culver's on a trip to go do mock trial competitions, that wasn't, so we sat down and had butter burgers and we talked about life. And she wanted to know. She just asked me point blank. She goes, "What's your story? Why are you here? Yeah. This doesn't make any sense." And in that conversation, she said to me, "You're wasting your life if you go back into radio." She says, you're one of the few who have woken up on the floor of a holding cell, unsure where you are, unsure what's going on, probably mad at yourself, probably ashamed, and had to go through a system that didn't care about you as a human being. She says, you need to be a lawyer. You need to go stand at that table and advocate for the people who aren't there to advocate for you. At no point in my life had anybody ever gotten to the heart of suggesting why you should exist. So for 2 years, this person who I barely knew would drive each summer 5 hours out to Winter and testify on my behalf of how I'm progressing. That led me to remove the shackles of my probation, to graduate from the University of South Dakota. So when I walked across the stage in 2009 and shook the hand of President Abbott, that turned my probation off. I applied to a bunch of law schools, got into none of them, until the University of South Dakota said, well, we have this sort of summer bummer league. We hold 10 spots for folks. If you want to come fight for it, Hunger Games style, you're in. And that's how I got to law school.
Well, gosh, if someone watches the YouTube version of this, I was getting a little emotional there, because I just feel like this is sort of part of the core thesis of Leadmore, is that's all it takes, right? Is one person to believe in you and one person to say that, like, no, you're going to go do this. And I know, and I believe in you. That's a leader. She was a leader, and now you have become a leader because of that moment. Right. And things could have played out so many different ways. And I think that's such a fascinating story. That's why I wanted to take time to track that story. And so then you go through law school, and I think we have to reference Thomas Jefferson here, because I know that you wrote your master's thesis about him. Where did that passion begin for him? I know it's also the name of your beagle. Jefferson.
I think it really just came down to a certain affection for history, but in particular, the Declaration of Independence, and just really studying that document a little bit. And if you study that document and then you start tracing back, how Jefferson thought, a lot of those thoughts and ideas came from other thinkers along the way. Thomas or John Locke. John Locke was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, not happiness. Jefferson changed it. So those things fueled my interest, my curiosity of here was somebody trying to be creative with what was given to him for his time and for longer time. And that just sort of spun into, okay, well, now I got to write something. I'm going to do a master's and I'm really going to dig into this. What is there to dig into? And personalities are fun. So Jefferson and John Marshall are, cousins, and that was interesting. But down in the heart of that, if we wanted to take a big a detour, we could talk about, the unitary theory of executive power. That's what I'm really interested when it comes to, government and presidents and history. How we model and how we constrain power, this being a leadership course, it is fascinating. I think all of us who are in leadership positions, if we haven't read the Federalist Papers specifically on the model of the president and in how the conversation came from, prior to or post the Constitution, there was thinkings that we should have an executive body, a committee that ran the country, right? Not a single president, because we were coming off of a monarchy. It should be 7 or 8 guys. Now imagine what that would be, right?
Yeah, if anyone's ever served on a board or a committee, right, you know how much actually gets done.
Yeah, so those things interest me. I didn't really totally grasp that from a leadership perspective. What I really was interested in was the sort of the power dynamics of the way that fueled the way that the country was born. I like origin stories. Origin stories are just really, for eons, human beings have moved human beings by our origin stories.
Well, that's why I wanted to dig into yours, right? Like, and I know this is an abbreviated version. We could go for hours on this, but before we move on back to your story, I wanted to ask you. I put down in my notes, but I don't think I showed this one to you. What would Jefferson say if he were here today about what's going on in our country? You've studied him deeply. What would he say?
Well, let me take the controversial side first. I think he would find it utterly fascinating of how Black Americans are in the middle of and are driving the conversation. I think for Jefferson, just who he was, being a slave owner, I think it's important to just start there.
Yeah. Yep.
I think he'd go there first. Then I think he would say, back to what I said earlier, and that is, okay, you all are pointing back to a document that we wrote in 1789. Your country, your world is different, folks. Rip it up, throw it away, start over. He'd want to know, who are the intellectuals?
Throw it away, you think?
Yeah, throw it away. He'd want to know who are the Thomas Jeffersons, who are the Alexander Hamiltons, who are the James Madisons. Those are all men, but then who are the Dolly Madisons and the Abigail Adams? Who are those people who fully understand the being and the spirit of America today? Put them in a room. Get those people together. I'm thinking of people like Cornell Booker and the John Myers of the world. These people who are really thinking about their communities and how do they grow their communities. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with Joe Burgum in Fargo.
Sure.
People like that, right? They're looking for the heartbeat of the place they live, and they're trying to build out how to make that heartbeat work for everybody. I think Jefferson would say, start over, folks.
That's fascinating. Okay, so you had this law degree. I know you got kind of into, I'm not sure exactly the timeline, but big into data and studying and understanding data. And then, I don't know if it was out of necessity or passion or almost payback, but based on having your own addiction story, you landed an organization, a brand new kind of baby organization called Face It Together to help cure addiction. Tell us how that got started.
Yeah, when I moved to Sioux Falls in 2006, the first person I met was the guy that helped me get there. His name is Tom. The second person I met outside of the house was the founder of that organization, Transitional Living Corporation. His name was Kevin Kirby. And I met him on my second day in Sioux Falls. He doesn't remember this, but he showed up in his very shiny Audi. And I was like, I've never been in a car like this before. This is amazing. And we went to an AA meeting. And I got to know Kevin just a little bit. But then I went to college and kind of got sidetracked. But during that process, I saw a flyer for a series of town hall meetings taking place in Sioux Falls. And the question that I recognized Kevin's name. The question that Kevin had put to the community was, what would Sioux Falls look like if it treated addiction like the chronic disease that it is? This was in 2008. And I knew that I had just gotten my license back. I had to do a breathalyzer in the morning and a breathalyzer at night. But on a Saturday, I could get in the car, I could drive to Sioux Falls, and I could hang out in those meetings. And so I got reconnected to Kevin, and I helped write the original bylaws for Face It Together. And I met the other co-founder, Charlie Day. And once as I was going through law school, I'd get phone calls from Charlie. He'd be like, so you still want to be a lawyer? Or do you really want to change the world? Another one of those guys, like he got you from day one, and he was just going to be that pest to make sure you were doing the right thing and not wasting your life. And so when the time came that I realized that for me to become a licensed practicing lawyer, I'd have to go through a pretty significant process to prove up my good moral character. I wrote an email to Kevin and Charlie, and I said, I'm just looking for help. I know you all know everybody. What's available? Otherwise, I'm going to go work for Kohl's in Sioux City.
Okay.
And, $130,000 in school debt. I got to do something,
yep.
To put it right on the head of a pin. And Charlie responded, and he said, why don't you come up and talk to us? We're expanding this organization called Face It Together, and maybe you would fit well. And so sure enough, there was 6 or 7 of us, and I joined basically a think tank to continue on that question. How do you solve this really challenging condition, which is really a social, environmental, emotional condition? How do you solve that? And so I got to go to an organization and just sit in rooms and think and read and talk and explore for 4 or 5 years. It was a remarkable experience.
With 4 or 5, weren't you there almost like a decade, or how long were you involved in the organization?
I was with Face It Together for about 7 years.
7, okay.
But for the first 4 years, there was just a few of us, sitting in a room. You've been to our old office in downtown Sioux Falls. We had a wall that you could write on it.
Mm-hmm.
It was a big wall in a glass case. It was an amazing office, and I'd sit there for hours and just think of these problems and workflow, issues or challenges and behaviors, and hold conversations with leading experts around the world at Harvard and in other places. Sanford Health is in our backyard, and just think about these problems. They don't solve themselves overnight, and you can't just sort of fly by night some of this stuff. You really got to put some thought to it, and so we got to do that for a few years.
Yeah, and what would you say? I know one thing I've learned both from our friendship, but also Face It being a client, is semantics are really important. The words that we use around this disease. Talk about that, because I know that the words are important.
Yeah, you use the word cure, and
I know. I think as soon as I said that, I paused because I had asked the wrong one. Right?
No, it's okay. It's okay. Once upon a time, I probably would have stopped you and said, "Hey, let's fix that." But yeah, that's really important. You're in the business of communications, mm-hmm. and words matter. Words carry more than just a definition; they carry emotion. And being in law school, my focus was trial advocacy, appellate advocacy, and so words really, really matter. and how you convey those words. So when we say words like alcoholic and junkie, and those are judgmental words. They drive with judgment. And so we can do better. We can talk about, John, the person struggling with addiction, or David, the person who has overcome and is now thriving beyond the condition of addiction. You might hear phrases like substance use disorder, and that's all fine. But yeah, when we, I think it's more about how we use words and the context that we put them in that really matter, because deep down at the core of addiction is this emptiness. Addiction is less about a neurological, genetic component. Put that aside. Addiction is really just the desire for an individual to overcome pain. Period. And addiction isn't just about alcohol, cocaine, heroin, opioids. It's phones, it's sex, it's gambling, it's, dare I say, work. Right? You asked a question in prep, and maybe you'll get down to it, but this idea of what should leaders do, or what can leaders do to help people that are struggling? I challenge the premise. I say, let's look at some leaders, because some leaders might be leaders simply because that's their addiction.
Interesting.
And they're in a position of power, of a title. And we, you talk about this in all of these episodes. Leadership isn't about a title.
Yeah.
So I went off of your script on that one, but addiction is the words that we use and the way we communicate around it really have to change.
Well, you've studied and thought about this problem for a long time, like you said, 7 years. So I want to know, being in a small organization, tackling a big problem, what did you learn, one, as a leader, and how did that shape you in your leadership journey, being a part of that organization that you're solving this problem? I have a lot of respect for people who are trying to solve problems that you maybe actually can never quite solve, right? You're always getting closer and closer, but sometimes it feels like it's getting further and further, because that just takes a lot of dedication. And every day you come to work and you get back to that whiteboard and you keep working on it. So what did you learn on your journey during those 7 years?
Yeah, it didn't exactly turn out this way, but what I learned is the concept of radical incrementalism and really fighting towards just progress. The big phrase within the 12-step community is progress, not perfection. And that really holds and rings true. I would say another thing is just on a kind of a business front is making sure that all individuals within the organization really truly understand that. I think that was one area that I failed at often, was sort of just being off on the side and kind of doing things and expecting everybody to just kind of be like, oh yeah, I get this. But not everybody gets, the vision that might be stuck in your head, and you might articulate it in a pretty good way. But when you're talking about complex ideas, it's really got to be kind of brought down to its essence for everybody in an organization. And if you really can't do that well, you'll run into challenges. And I think we as an organization at Face Together during my time, we ran into those challenges often.
And what did that, how did that inform, and we'll get to this next, what you are doing now on your own, some of those challenges? Because you're still, I guess I'll let you introduce what you're doing too, but you're still trying to tackle this same problem.
Yeah. Well, about 2 months after joining Face It Together, we had a leader at one of the health systems in town come to the office. And the two health systems were early funders, investors in the nonprofit. They were just getting an update. And one of them said to our two co-founders in a meeting, they said, look, you guys, the story of redemption is great. It's powerful. Keep telling it. But it's not data. And so Charlie, being Charlie, one of the things that he learned over his years was, if you hear something in a meeting and it's what you need to hear, the meeting's over.
That's good.
So he left the meeting. He walked out.
Oh, no way.
He walked over to my desk and he said, David, you've got 30 days. Figure out how to measure addiction recovery.
Wow.
So that began a process and a journey of trying to understand how do you measure a behavioral output or behavior change, and who am I to do that?
Sure.
except for we have a problem in front of us. Find the smartest people that you have around you, and give them a task. So that was one learning. It was, maybe you can recognize what the problem is and you can see smart people around you and just hand it to them. Give them the hot flaming thing and walk away. And what that did is, over the course of now 7 years, I've been trying to figure that out. And so developing a survey tool and going through the rigorous process of testing it and changing it and getting feedback, and sometimes not being so structured, but just things happening and changing over time, and then running it again through another scientific process to validate it the way healthcare scientists would require and demand. Otherwise, it's, worthless.
Yeah, because was that data, at the end of the day, does it just come down to dollars and cents and ROI and data? Was that the main reason, or they just wanted to know that progress was happening?
Scientists are funny people. Scientists are interested in following a particular process. And if that process isn't followed, then they don't trust it. It's a great way to live. Sometimes, you're kind of giving me this look like, well, as a business person, we've got other problems to solve. And if I can do it without following those steps, I'm going to do it. Right.
Sure.
Science doesn't work that way. And that's probably good, because it could kill people. But in this sense, when you're trying to actually create something like this, it's more about, did it follow a particular process, and will the scientist trust it in its creation and in its deployment? Yeah. Those are big hurdles to overcome.
When you talked about finding smarter people to solve this problem and giving them that flaming problem to solve, I think that's a great lesson from leaders in terms of, if you're growing a team, when can you recognize people that are actually better at the task than you are, and put your ego in check and bring them on board and get them inspired to solve that problem, because you're maybe not always are the right person. And so that makes me think of your time. You were a Bush Fellow, which you got that amazing opportunity, which I'll let you talk about, which gave you the chance to go learn from the best people, both in one-on-ones and conferences, events. So talk about what you was at 2017, what year was that?
2015.
15.
Yeah, it was a 2-year experience, $100,000, and the chance to figure out, how can I be a better leader around this idea of really trying to understand, how do you motivate change, especially with a condition that's challenged by change, and inject data into that understanding. I know nothing about data or data science, and so I traveled the world. I got to go hang out with the folks from the Social Progress Index in Iceland for a couple of years. It took me to Copenhagen for 5 weeks of a sabbatical and walking the lakes of Copenhagen with Mike Viking, who runs the Happiness Research Institute. I watched Hal Varner from Google talk about how economics work around social and behavioral motivations. A lot of different things like that, and to have that ability to just go sit in a room and be divergent from the thing that you're working on every day it's a luxury, but it's also a necessity. If you want to solve big problems, one could look at that and say, well, okay, now you're 5 or 6 years removed from that. Now what are you doing?
Sure.
And I think that's kind of where we're at now. Now it's taking all of that stuff and putting it into the kaleidoscope and figuring out what's the curious combination, as Mark Twain says, that's going to work.
Well, then that's a perfect transition, I think, because you had another one of those people nudge you, and I know the story because you've mentioned to me more than once, where somebody in that Bush Fellowship interview said a statement to you that sort of left an imprint on your future path. And what did they say?
Yeah, this is the final round. There's like 30 of us going through rapid fire interviews, and a professor from the Carlson School of Business says to me, he had no questions. He just listened, and then at the just as the time was running out, he said, "Look, David, if at the end of the 2 years you don't have a business out of this, out of what you're going to learn and are thinking about, and what you've told us you want to do, you completely wasted this opportunity." And I mean, there are days that go by where I'll wake up and I'm just in a sweat because I'm like, that guy is still, nagging at me. And I think we all need that from time to time, is just to have that thing just lingering there, whether it results in anything, but just constant win in our sails.
Yep, absolutely. And so maybe you didn't hit that time frame of 24 months, but we are sitting here in 2020, and tell us what you're working on now, because I would say you're on the way to checking that box.
Yeah, the thing I invented at Face It Together was this thing called the Recovery Capital Index. It's a quantification and qualification tool for measuring well-being, measuring change. Now, relative to addiction, but it has many different applications. And so, there was a moment where we knew that there was something that could spin out of the nonprofit. Mm-hmm. We just didn't know what it would be or when or how. But there was something that existed on the wall for close to 4 years. And, through COVID and through having, we published an article in the South Dakota Medical Journal that validated the RCI, Recovery Capital Index. After doing that, I started to get a bunch of phone calls asking if this thing was commercially available.
Interesting.
Could people license it? And we all looked around the room and said, well, yes, but how do we do that?
Yeah.
And then a group from Palm Beach County calls up and says, no, we actually want this. And we had a check in the bank before there was a product.
Wow.
Right. The product was coming together. And so,
that's the way to do it.
That was a moment of saying, okay, now that things are changing within the organization and we've got to recalibrate for new times ahead. David, do you want to take the risk? Do you want to go make this a thing? And that's when you look hard and gulp a few times and say, okay, yeah, now's the time to do it. And so that's where we are, and we spun it out, and I have the opportunity to commercialize this, and in doing so, some portion of every customer, every partner, every extension of that technology is going to go back and benefit the mission of Face It Together. It's going to fuel the ability to save people's lives and transform them, and that's ultimately, at the end of the day, that's the other sail. That's the other wind in the sail.
That's great. Yeah, that's your why, right? Your get out of bed every day. Yeah. So to retrace or connect those dots, so Face Together brought you to Denver. Now, as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, you could go wherever you want, which made sense to reunite with your wife under one roof. And now you're in Potsdam. So we talked about semantics and words being so powerful. If you I could see you doing this. I know you've given a TED Talk, but if you could give a talk or address the nation, how does our culture need to change the narrative or the language around addiction? If you could wave your magic wand.
Well, my running mantra about addiction today is we'll solve addiction when we don't solve for addiction.
Okay, unpack that.
Yeah, so all of the solutions and everything that we bring to the table we go to the end point, the end state of the problem. So the drugs, the actual substance. We need to get people into treatment. All of that is great, but that will never solve the problem. The problem, addiction, is fundamentally a state of despair. It's fueled by trauma. And I know when you hear that word trauma, you're probably thinking towards things that we're seeing today in our world. Individuals sitting in a car and seeing their father shot, right? That's traumatic. But for other people, it could be just waking up every day and hearing through a certain tone our fathers or our mothers talk to us or talk to other people around us in a really dehumanizing way. That is traumatic, right? Those traumas fuel why we need to go and engage in a behavior or a substance to bring us pleasure. And I think we need to reverse engineer all the way back to that. And then what I'd say is, now that we're there, what does that environment look like around us? What do our schools look like? What do our communities look like? How are our roads put together? How do we engage and commute from the places that we go to, and where are the places that we spend our time? How are those places set up to ensure that everybody has the right opportunity to grow through purpose and to live meaningful lives? Everybody. Yeah. And when we do that, and we do that long enough over time, we'll still have addictions. They'll be different, and they'll be less intense.
So I was going to ask you the follow-up, and maybe you just kind of answered it there. So it sounds like the solution is social, economic, environmental. I mean, it's the whole comprehensive issue. Because what I was going to ask is, can we solve addiction?
Absolutely. Yeah. We have to build better cities and better communities.
Cool. All right. Well, one more, and then we're going to do our rapid fire. So if a leader is listening to this, and whatever context you put that in, if they manage a board, a team, there could be a coach, or, as you said, part of the point of Leadmore is they don't have to have the title, but every leader is working with other people in some context. If they spot or recognize that a team member, a friend, a family member is struggling with addiction, and I think you're right when you talk about trauma, we maybe don't even know the forms of addiction that something like COVID could cause or create. How do they, one, maybe spot it, and two, what should they do?
Well, in terms of spotting, I think for the most part, people begin to remove themselves from the normal flow of activity. So if you've got somebody who is regularly engaged in meetings, who's showing up every day, who is getting work done on time, is participating in all the things that make up the work or the culture of a company, and now they're slowly pulling back from that. And if you notice that, not to say that it's addiction, but it could be anything, right? That could ultimately lead towards certain things. I think that's when you jump in and say, "Hey, John, I've just noticed that maybe you're a little less engaged. Am I reading that right? And if I'm wrong, tell me to bug off. But
sure,
let me know."
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. Sort of kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? De-arms them a little bit. It's not too aggressive.
Yeah, and it's not you, but it's me. I've noticed, and I just want to make sure that maybe if I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong.
Sure.
Right. I'm just my job is to look out for everybody on the team. That's my job. And so I'm just running a check with you. You're not the last one, right? I'm going to go ask so-and-so too. You're not the last one. And I think that's really important too, that we don't just single people out. Yeah. You're the only one that doesn't show up anymore. Well, that you've just created a wall, right?
And I think what you're saying is so true. Those indicators are even harder to find now in this more remote work world, because before we had attendance and, timeliness and body language. And, now you can kind of be on a Zoom call without mentally being on a Zoom call. Right. So it's even harder to spot. So I cut you off. And then how do we help? So that's how we spot. What can we do then? If they say, actually, yes, I am struggling.
Yeah. And if somebody does say, yes, there are issues here or problems, the trick isn't just defaulting to sort of the usual suspects. My initial reaction towards anybody who says, yeah, I'm really struggling, I'm a big fan of just general therapy. Everybody, I don't care who you are, you should spend minimum 4 hours a year with a therapist. Once a quarter, go sit down for an hour with a therapist. I do it online now. It's an oil change, right? For me.
I like that.
Psychological oil change. I got to get it done, or else I won't be able to go the next 5,000 miles. It just has to happen. So build that into your company, build that into your culture, build that into what you offer, or just make it available in that moment. That can make a difference. Now, of course, you got to get the right counselor and the right therapist. That matters too. But sometimes it's really just starting there. And then also just the fact that you're asking the question and you want to help. Sometimes that can be enough for some people, depending upon the size of the problem.
That's great. Love that. Love the psychological oil change. That's great. So we hit a lot of the nuggets just by tracing your journey, which was great. I want to dig into the rapid fire portion here, where we get to know a little bit more about you and what makes you tick. So I know you're a reader. What are you reading right now?
Well, it wouldn't surprise you. The book I'm reading right now is called Happy City.
Okay.
It's Charles Montgomery. And the idea is looking at the urban space, but there's nuggets of sort of urban being existing in rural, and just trying to figure out, well, how do we have to transform those spaces for better, happier lives generally, and really looking at urban design, architecture, those particular expertise to sort of think about these things. I call it social architecture. It's really, It's kind of a manual for social architecture, which is kind of it's a terrible phrase, but.
Cool. I like it. Happy City. How have you, in that spirit, maybe it's therapy, but how do you unplug or de-stress during a global pandemic? What helps you to just disconnect a bit?
I walk. I do a lot of walking. I average I think I'm averaging this month 11,600 and some odd steps.
Okay.
So it's about 4.5 to 5 miles of walking a day.
Phone calls or just walking?
Just walking. It's on my schedule. Now I have a dog, but it's on my calendar. So 9:00 every morning, I go for a walk. 7:30 every night or 6:30 every night after dinner, go for a walk. If I have a series of phone calls, I'll take those. I'll go walk and take those.
Yeah.
But it's walking.
Cool.
And we do a hike every Saturday as well.
Okay, I was going to say you walk together. Yeah. Cool.
So, yeah.
That's great. I think you've heard me talk about this before, but at Lemonly in interviews, we ask people, what is your superpower? What's the one thing you do better than everyone else?
That's really, I've heard other guests say it's really hard to sort of get there, but because we don't want to overstate ourselves.
You want to brag, yeah, you bet.
I think the one thing I do is I can see connections that others tend to miss, and maybe those connections might be a little bit out there, and not quite on the surface, or 8, 10, 12 steps down the line. But that's where my mind immediately goes is, I'm looking beyond that first layer always. I'm constantly trying to see what are the other, deeper layers and how do they relate? And just playing in that for as long as I can, either until I've worn out the game and there's no end, or I've found something that sticks.
I would agree. I would echo, or I would agree that is your superpower. I think when I come to you what's the gap that I'm missing, right? And usually it comes in the form, you're too nice. So it's just like a gentle question or like a soft nudge. It's never like, you should go do this, but you connect the dots that I didn't realize were connected. So, and lastly, we like to know from all of our leaders here on Leadmore, who are the leaders and mentors, you could know them or not know them, study them, that have inspired you?
I already mentioned her at this point, but the one that just comes to my mind is Sandy McEwen. She is a professor at the University of South Dakota. She's been there for quite a long time. She was the one that said to me that I should go to law school. If I was going to write a book about her, and somebody needs to write a book about her because her life is really, really intriguing. It's just she wouldn't let you do it. There's just no way. But the book will be titled Quiet Lion. Her whole drive, she wants to build advocates. She wants advocates in the world for whatever it is. It's not a position of anyone. It's what are you going to advocate for to make the people around you better, to make the things around you better, to just make the world better. And so she trains advocates. And she just goes about it in a way that she's one of those people who will work out her career at the university very quietly, but thousands of us will just hold her dear because of the way that she has led to motivate people to just be better.
That's awesome. I love that. Creating more advocates. We definitely need more of that, just like I believe we need more leaders. So, David, thank you for being a leader and for giving us some time here today. This was a great conversation.
It was special. Privilege. Thank you, John.
All right, take care. So that was our fantastic conversation with Mr. David Whitesock. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks to David for his time. And thanks to David for really bringing some really difficult topics to think about and to consider, and some advice on how to help those as leaders, those around us who may also be struggling with addiction. That was a really important conversation. And a quick reminder, we now have launched the Leadmore community. It's a place where we launch content, weekly content around the topic of leadership. And you also have a safe, private place to discuss and answer your questions. We bring guests back from these shows for behind the scenes Q&A and much, much more. To check that out, you can go to community.leadmorepodcast.com. Thanks again for listening to the show.